For decades, the Battle of Tarawa was remembered as one of the bloodiest island assaults of the Pacific War. History books focused on the beaches, the shallow reefs, and the fierce resistance that shocked Allied commanders. But long after the final shots were fired and the island was declared secured, Tarawa revealed a far darker secret. Beneath its sand and shattered concrete lay an underground world that few had truly understood. Inside sealed bunkers and collapsed tunnels, 1,417 bodies were eventually discovered. Not scattered in chaos, but trapped in silence. This is the story of how an island became a tomb, and why the truth beneath Tarawa is so chilling. Tarawa was small, barely visible on most maps, yet its importance was immense. Located in the Gilbert Islands, it sat directly in the path of Allied advances across the Central Pacific. For Japan, Tarawa was not just another outpost, it was a shield, a forward line of defense meant to slow the enemy and prove that Japanese fortifications could not be broken. Losing it would expose the next layers of the empire's defenses. Because of this, Japanese planners transformed Tarawa into a fortress far beyond what its size suggested. Concrete bunkers were poured into the coral ground. Artillery positions were reinforced with steel and earth. Trenches connected firing points, while an extensive network of tunnels was carved beneath the surface. These underground spaces were designed to protect troops from bombardment and allow resistance to continue, even if surface positions were overrun. Supplies were stockpiled. Medical rooms were prepared. Command posts were buried deep. On paper, Tarawa was ready to fight indefinitely. What these plans did not fully account for was isolation. As the Pacific War intensified in 1943, Allied commanders identified Tarawa as a necessary target. It could not be bypassed without leaving a dangerous threat behind. The decision to invade was made, and preparations began with urgency. The assault would be swift, overwhelming, and direct. When Allied forces landed, they encountered resistance far stronger than expected. Shallow reefs delayed landing craft, leaving troops exposed. Japanese defenders fought fiercely from bunkers and fortified positions. The surface battle was brutal and costly, lasting only days, but leaving a lasting mark on military history. Eventually, resistance on the surface collapsed. Japanese defensive lines were broken, and the island was declared secured. From the outside, the battle appeared over. Flags were raised. Commanders reported victory. The focus shifted toward recovery, cleanup, and preparation for future operations. But Tarawa was not finished. As engineers and recovery teams moved across the island, they noticed something unsettling. Many bunkers were sealed shut. Some entrances were collapsed deliberately. Others showed no signs of battle damage, yet remained closed from within. Initial assumptions suggested isolated holdouts or abandoned positions. What followed would challenge those assumptions entirely. When the first bunkers were forced open, the discovery was shocking. Inside were bodies, dozens at first. Then more, soldiers found at their posts, in medical rooms, in command areas. There were no signs of last stands or desperate fighting. Weapons were often unused, supplies remained. The men inside had not been killed in combat. They had been trapped. As more bunkers were opened, the count grew. Recovery teams moved carefully, documenting each site. Tunnel after tunnel told the same silent story. Units that had retreated underground during the battle never emerged. Cut off from communication, unaware that the surface had fallen, they remained where doctrine and duty told them to stay. Over time, air ran out. Flooding seeped in, conditions deteriorated. Escape became impossible. The final count reached 1,417. This number stunned Allied commanders and historians alike. These were not casualties recorded during the battle itself. They were deaths that occurred after resistance had effectively ended. Men who survived the assault above ground but were lost beneath it. The discovery forced a painful reevaluation of what Tarawa truly represented. To understand why this happened, one must understand the mindset behind the defenses. Japanese military doctrine emphasized endurance, sacrifice, and resistance to the last. Surrender was considered dishonorable. Retreat without orders was unthinkable. Soldiers were trained to hold positions regardless of circumstances, trusting that higher command understood the situation. When communication failed, that trust became deadly. Inside the bunkers, time lost meaning. Without information, soldiers could not know the battle was over. They believed they were still part of a larger defense. Some expected counterattacks. Others believed reinforcements would arrive. Few could imagine that the island had already fallen. Tarawa's underground tragedy remained largely unspoken for years. It did not fit neatly into narratives of victory or defeat. It was neither heroic charge nor dramatic last stand. It was something far more unsettling, a lesson about what happens when preparation becomes rigidity, and when belief leaves no room for survival. This story is not told to shock, but to remember, because history is not only written on the surface. Sometimes, its most important truths are buried beneath our feet. To understand how 1,417 soldiers died beneath Tarawa, we must descend into the underground world they lived in. These bunkers were not simple shelters meant for brief protection. They were engineered environments designed to function as command centers, medical stations, and last-resort defensive positions. For the Japanese garrison, going underground was not a sign of defeat. It was the next phase of battle. The tunnel systems beneath Tarawa were complex and interconnected. Narrow passages linked firing positions to command rooms. Storage chambers held ammunition, food, and water. Medical bunkers were stocked with basic supplies to treat wounded soldiers who could not be moved above ground. Ventilation shafts were carved upward to bring in fresh air, while reinforced entrances were built to withstand bombardment. Everything was designed with endurance in mind. During the Allied assault, many Japanese units followed doctrine and retreated into these bunkers once surface positions became untenable. From their perspective, this was not a collapse, but a transition. They believed the enemy would suffer heavy losses attempting to clear fortified tunnels. They believed time was on their side. What they did not realize was how quickly the situation above ground was changing. Allied forces focused on eliminating organized resistance rather than clearing every underground space. Once key positions were secured and visible opposition ended, the island was considered taken. With communication lines destroyed, the underground defenders had no way of knowing this. Radios failed. Telephone cables were severed. Runners sent through tunnels never returned. Isolation became absolute. Inside the bunkers, daily routines continued at first. Watches were kept. Wounded were treated. Weapons were maintained. Officers attempted to maintain order and morale, believing they were still part of an ongoing defense. But as hours turned into days, conditions began to deteriorate. Ventilation systems were among the first failures. Bombardment collapsed shafts and filled passages with dust and debris. Air circulation slowed, oxygen levels dropped. In the humid heat of Tarawa, breathing became increasingly difficult. Soldiers weakened, not from wounds, but from exhaustion and lack of air. Water, though stockpiled, was limited. Some storage containers were damaged. Others became contaminated as flooding seeped into lower tunnels during high tides. Medical conditions worsened. Infections spread. Without evacuation routes or fresh supplies, even minor injuries became life-threatening. Despite this, surrender was rarely considered. Japanese military culture at the time emphasized obedience and endurance above all else. Soldiers were taught that holding their position was a duty that extended beyond personal survival. Without clear orders to withdraw or surrender, many felt they had no choice but to remain where they were. In some bunkers, officers reportedly debated their options. Breaking out risked immediate confrontation with enemy forces. Staying underground offered a chance, however slim, that the situation above would change. With no information, hope became the only resource left. As days passed, that hope faded. Some bunkers attempted coordinated breakouts, only to find entrances collapsed or guarded. Others sealed themselves completely, believing it would buy more time. These decisions, made under extreme pressure, sealed their fate. When Allied engineers later entered these spaces, they found scenes that spoke volumes. Soldiers positioned at firing ports that were never used. Medical staff beside patients they could no longer help. Commanders seated at tables with maps still pinned to walls, showing defensive lines that had already fallen. There was little evidence of panic, no signs of widespread disorder. Instead, there was a haunting stillness. The men inside had remained disciplined to the end, following training that gave them no alternative path. The discovery of so many bodies underground forced Allied commanders to confront an uncomfortable reality. Victory on the surface did not mean the battle was truly over. There were layers of war that continued unseen, with consequences no less tragic. It also raised questions about bunker warfare itself. Fortifications designed to protect soldiers had become deadly traps once adaptability was removed from the equation. The very strength of Tarawa's defenses contributed to the scale of the underground loss. For historians, Tarawa's bunkers became a case study in the dangers of rigid doctrine, preparation without flexibility, discipline without contingency, belief without communication. The 417 soldiers who died underground were not forgotten because they were insignificant. They were forgotten because their story did not fit comfortably into simplified narratives of heroism or defeat. It was quieter, more complex, and far more unsettling. As we move forward, the question becomes even more difficult. When exactly did these men realize they were alone? And what choices were truly available to them in those final moments? The answers lie in the discovery itself, and in the silence that followed when the world finally opened Tarawa's sealed doors. The discovery of the bodies beneath Tarawa did not happen all at once. It unfolded slowly, bunker by bunker, tunnel by tunnel, each finding adding weight to a growing realization that something extraordinary had occurred underground. At first, Allied recovery teams believed they were encountering isolated pockets of resistance that had collapsed after the battle. But as numbers rose into the hundreds, it became clear this was not a series of small tragedies. It was a single massive one. Engineering units were tasked with securing the island for future operations. Their job included clearing unexploded ordnance, repairing airstrips, and inspecting defensive structures. When they approached the underground bunkers, caution was standard procedure. Some were booby-trapped. Others were suspected of hiding surviving combatants. Doors were opened carefully, often after repeated warnings were issued. What they found was silence. Inside the first major bunker complex, dozens of bodies were discovered in orderly positions. Soldiers lay where they had worked and waited. Some were seated, others were on stretchers. A few were positioned near firing ports that had never been used. There were no signs of a final battle, no evidence of a desperate last stand. The men had not been overrun. They had simply never come out. As more bunkers were opened, the pattern repeated. Medical chambers held patients who had clearly been receiving care until resources ran out. Command rooms contained officers beside maps and documents, suggesting they had remained at their posts to the end. Supply rooms still held ammunition and rations, confirming that these deaths were not caused by immediate shortages, but by isolation. The count climbed steadily. Each bunker added names to a growing ledger. 50 here, 80 there. Some complexes contained more than 100 bodies. When the final tally reached 1,417, it stunned everyone involved. This number did not appear in battle reports. It was not reflected in casualty lists compiled during the fighting. These deaths existed in a separate category, one that challenged how the battle itself was understood. Military analysts began asking difficult questions. Why were these soldiers never evacuated? Why did no surrender occur once the surface battle was clearly lost? Why were so many entrances sealed from the inside? Investigations revealed that many bunker commanders had no knowledge that organized resistance above ground had ended. Communication failures were total. Radios were destroyed early in the battle. Telephone lines were severed. Backup systems failed. Once underground units lost contact, they became isolated islands within an island. Time played a cruel role. Without daylight or external reference, days blurred together. Some units may have survived for several days after the island was secured, believing the fight continued. By the time they realized something was wrong, physical conditions had already deteriorated beyond recovery. Flooding was one of the most common causes of death. Tarawa's low elevation and porous coral ground allowed seawater to seep into lower tunnels during high tides. Ventilation shafts clogged with debris. Oxygen levels dropped. In some bunkers, carbon dioxide buildup made prolonged survival impossible. Medical officers recorded desperate attempts to manage conditions with limited means. Improvised ventilation methods were tried. Rations were strictly controlled. But without external support, these measures only delayed the inevitable. The psychological toll was equally severe. Soldiers trained to endure hardship suddenly faced an enemy they could not fight. There were no targets, no orders, no clear objective. Doctrine demanded resistance, but reality offered no battlefield on which to apply it. For Allied commanders, the discovery of the 1,117 bodies forced a re-examination of bunker warfare. It became clear that simply declaring an island secure did not end all resistance. Underground networks could continue to exist in deadly isolation, invisible to surface operations. This realization influenced future campaigns. Clearing procedures were revised. Greater emphasis was placed on communication, intelligence, and verification. Tarawa became a lesson learned at an immense human cost. For historians, the discovery complicated the narrative of the battle. Tarawa was already known as a costly assault. Now it was also a symbol of unseen suffering. The underground deaths did not change the outcome of the battle, but they changed how victory itself was defined. The men who died beneath Tarawa were not anonymous casualties of chaos. They were soldiers following orders as they understood them. Their fate was shaped not by lack of courage, but by a system that offered no alternative once conditions changed. As the island moved on and war continued elsewhere, the bunkers were sealed again. Some collapsed naturally, others were intentionally closed. The world turned its attention forward, but the underground truth remained. The count of 1,417 became more than a statistic. It became a warning that wars do not end cleanly, a warning that silence can be as deadly as gunfire, and a warning that the most devastating consequences of conflict are often hidden, waiting patiently beneath the surface to be discovered long after the battle is declared over. The true climax of the Tarawa tragedy did not occur during the amphibious landings or the fierce fighting on the beaches. It unfolded quietly underground, where doctrine, belief, and isolation combined to create a fatal outcome. To understand why so many soldiers remained trapped until death, one must examine the system that shaped every decision they made long before the battle began. Japanese military doctrine before and during World War II emphasized absolute loyalty, endurance, and resistance without retreat. Soldiers were trained to believe that holding a position was a moral duty, not a tactical choice. Withdrawal without orders was seen as failure. Surrender was considered dishonor, not only for the individual, but for their family and unit. This belief system was deeply ingrained and reinforced through training, command structure, and culture. On Tarawa, this doctrine became law inside the bunkers. When surface defenses began to collapse, retreating underground was not viewed as a desperate act. It was an expected phase of defense. Commanders believed the bunkers would allow them to continue fighting, inflict further losses, and wait for either reinforcements or new orders. The possibility that the island could fall completely, leaving them isolated with no communication, was not seriously planned for. Once communication was lost, doctrine replaced information. Without radios or contact with higher command, bunker leaders relied entirely on what they had been taught. Hold position, endure. Do not surrender. These instructions made sense in a coordinated defense. In isolation, they became deadly. Inside the bunkers, officers faced impossible choices. Attempting a breakout meant exposing exhausted and wounded soldiers to enemy forces they could not assess. Remaining underground meant trusting that the situation above would eventually change. With no evidence either way, many chose the option that aligned with their training and honor. As time passed, the cost of that decision became clear. Supplies that were meant to last weeks became unusable due to flooding or contamination. Ventilation failures made breathing increasingly difficult. Medical staff worked with diminishing resources, treating injuries and illnesses they could no longer manage. Commanders attempted to maintain order and morale, issuing routines and watches even as conditions worsened. There was no panic because panic was not part of the doctrine. Discipline held, even as survival chances disappeared. This rigid structure prevented adaptive decision-making. No contingency existed for total isolation. There were no standing orders allowing surrender if communication failed. There were no escape plans once underground positions were compromised. Doctrine had been designed for resistance, not survival. The tragedy beneath Tarawa was not the result of cruelty or negligence at the individual level. It was the outcome of a system that valued symbolic resistance over human life. The soldiers who died underground were doing exactly what they believed was expected of them. For Allied forces, the discovery forced uncomfortable reflection. Military planners realized that enemy casualties could continue even after victory was declared. Clearing bunkers became a priority in later campaigns, not just for security, but to prevent similar unseen losses. Loudspeaker calls, information leaflets, and communication efforts were expanded to encourage surrender and prevent isolation. Tarawa changed how underground warfare was understood. It revealed that fortifications could become prisons, that discipline could become a trap, and that victory without communication could still result in tragedy. For Japan, the loss carried deep psychological weight. Tarawa was supposed to demonstrate the strength of island defenses. Instead, it exposed their limitations. The belief that fortified positions could delay the enemy indefinitely was shaken. The human cost of rigid doctrine became impossible to ignore, even if it was rarely discussed openly during the war. The men who died in Tarawa's bunkers were not reckless. They were loyal, disciplined, and committed. Their fate was sealed by a system that left no room for adaptation when conditions changed faster than orders could travel. This is why Tarawa's underground truth remains so unsettling. It is not a story of brutality alone. It is a story of belief carried too far, of preparation that allowed no flexibility, of soldiers who endured exactly as they were taught, even when endurance led nowhere. As the war moved on and new battles were fought across the Pacific, the lessons of Tarawa quietly reshaped military thinking. But for the 1,417 who never emerged, those lessons came too late. Their story forces us to confront a difficult truth. In war, the greatest danger is not always the enemy in front of you. Sometimes it is the inability to change when the world around you already has. Tarawa today is a quiet island, its beaches sunlit and its coral reefs peaceful. Visitors see a tropical paradise that belies the horrors it once concealed. But beneath the surface, the scars remain. The bunkers that once served as defensive strongholds and later as tombs for 1,417 soldiers still stand. Some partially collapsed, some sealed forever. They serve as a chilling reminder of the human cost of rigid doctrine, isolation, and the relentless machinery of war. The aftermath of Tarawa was as significant as the battle itself. The discovery of the underground dead forced military planners, historians, and strategists to reconsider assumptions about warfare in the Pacific. It demonstrated that victory on the surface does not guarantee total control, that fortifications, no matter how well engineered, can become traps if flexibility, communication, and adaptability are absent. The lessons were profound, influencing not only post-war Japanese military thinking, but also Allied approaches to amphibious operations and bunker clearing in subsequent campaigns. The sheer scale of the loss, 1,117 bodies found within sealed bunkers, challenged conventional narratives about heroism and casualty reporting. These soldiers were not victims of direct combat in the conventional sense. Many were trained, disciplined, and following orders precisely. Yet, because the system they trusted failed to provide guidance or alternatives when the battle above ended, their adherence to doctrine became fatal. This was not just an operational failure, it was a human tragedy on a massive scale. For historians, Tarawa became a case study in the dangers of inflexible military strategy. It highlighted how cultural and doctrinal values, when combined with a lack of real-time intelligence and communication, could turn well-prepared soldiers into victims of circumstance. It raised difficult ethical questions about obedience, duty, and the moral responsibilities of command structures in wartime. How far should adherence to orders go when survival is at stake? At what point does loyalty become a death sentence? The psychological impact of the discovery extended beyond the battlefield. Families in Japan, many of whom had reported soldiers as missing or presumed dead in combat, received confirmation of a fate that was horrifying and impersonal. Unlike battlefield casualties that can be contextualized through reports and stories, these deaths were silent and contained, leaving only the concrete walls of bunkers as witnesses. The scale and method of death, trapped, isolated, and unassisted, shattered any simplistic understanding of wartime heroism and the nature of sacrifice. Allied forces, too, learned from Tarawa. Future campaigns incorporated lessons about clearing underground networks, verifying complete control of objectives, and providing opportunities for enemy forces to surrender. Psychological operations, loudspeaker warnings, and leaflets aimed at isolated defenders became standard practice to prevent similar tragedies. Commanders began to understand that victory was not only measured by the number of enemy positions taken, but by the minimization of unnecessary loss of life on both sides. Tarawa forced military planners to see that ignoring the underground reality of a battlefield could result in tragic, avoidable deaths. The island itself became a living memorial. Over the decades, historians, military engineers, and preservationists have studied the bunkers to better understand the conditions that contributed to the deaths. Some structures have been maintained for research. Others have naturally collapsed into the coral and sand. The presence of these remnants ensures that Tarawa is not remembered solely for the beaches and the famous amphibious assault, but also for the hidden tragedy beneath. Tarawa also offers enduring lessons for modern military and civilian planning. Isolation, poor communication, and adherence to inflexible systems are not limited to warfare. In emergency management, disaster response, and large-scale operational planning, the story of Tarawa serves as a stark reminder. Even the best-prepared systems can fail catastrophically if they do not account for uncertainty, real-time information, and the human element. The deaths in the bunkers illustrate the profound consequences of rigid structures without adaptability. Beyond the practical and strategic lessons, Tarawa stands as a symbol of remembrance. Each of the 1,417 soldiers lost beneath the island's bunkers represents not just a statistic, but a human life. A story interrupted, a family affected, and a legacy intertwined with the broader narrative of the Pacific War. Their silence underlines the cost of war, beyond the visible battles and headlines. In this sense, Tarawa's underground truth is as important as the surface combat itself. The lasting impact of the tragedy also lies in its ability to challenge the way we think about military success. Battles are often measured by speed, territory gained, and enemy casualties. Yet Tarawa reminds us that the true cost of war includes those who die unseen, uncounted, and unacknowledged for decades. The 1,417 soldiers who perished underground represent a hidden dimension of human suffering, one that forces us to consider the consequences of strategy, doctrine, and leadership decisions on individual lives. Finally, Tarawa serves as a lesson in humility and remembrance. The island's calm beaches and clear waters today are starkly at odds with the intense, desperate struggle and the silent deaths that occurred beneath its surface. This duality between the beauty of nature and the tragedy of human conflict reminds us that history is not only about what we see and celebrate, but also about what we uncover, honor, and learn from. In conclusion, the story of Tarawa's underground dead is not simply a tale of wartime loss. It is a profound reflection on obedience, survival, and the consequences of systems that fail to adapt. It is a cautionary lesson about the limits of human endurance when doctrine overrules flexibility. And most importantly, it is a story that demands remembrance. By studying, sharing, and understanding the events that led to the deaths of 1,417 soldiers trapped beneath the coral and concrete of Tarawa, we honor their memory and ensure that the lessons of the past continue to guide the decisions of the future. History, in its silence beneath the surface, often speaks louder than any battle cry. Tarawa's story is proof of that truth.